Right, so let me see if I can explain each one. So moderation. Okay, so let's try and unpack this, right? Every school does things differently, right? So therefore, if I submit, like the school gets all of your assessments, right? And then we get a set of scores from you, okay? So let's suppose this is what we submit for you guys, okay? I don't know. I'll put it in rank order, okay? So someone gets, say, 90, 88, 75, and 60, okay? So suppose that's what we get out of you guys. That's how we, after your assessments have been weighted and all put together, you know, there's 4 of you and this is what we think of you, okay? Now the problem with this is that in some ways, this mark is totally manufactured, it's totally artificial, right? Because based on how I write the assessments and how I mark, like what criteria I use and that kind of thing, this 90, it could just as easily have been like a 91 or a 95. Like, who's there to arbitrate between whether it should have been one or the other? The school is kind of, with regard to these marks, is king, can do whatever it likes. It can submit whatever it likes to the Board of Studies, okay? And you know, if I'm a bit of a sneaky kind of teacher, right, and I'm like, I want my students to do really well, you might have heard that you've got the HSC final exam and the school mark, and it's 50-50. Who's heard that before? People heard that before? Yeah, okay. Now here's the thing, they are 50-50, but they're not the same kind of 50, right? Because what if, instead of this, I thought, well, okay, if they're just going to take 50% of this mark, and I want my students to do really well, right? I'm just going to say, yeah, they're all awesome, right? Why not just, what stops me from submitting all these marks, and then the Board of Studies says, oh, well, look, they're all 99s. I guess we'll take half of that, and then put half with the exam, okay? So these raw marks, in other words, that come from the school, in many ways, they're meaningless, right? Because I can, as a teacher, or as a head teacher, more likely, I can make these marks whatever I like, okay? But you still want to take them into account. Can anyone tell me, given that they're so subjective and schools can do whatever they like, why are school marks useful? Why would they be useful to the Board of Studies? Okay, all right. So I'm going to get from this rankings, right? Now the rankings get used, okay? These raw marks, they're going to get ignored in a second, okay? But the rankings don't, they stay, okay? But why would the rankings off of the school mark, which I can just manufacture, why would they be useful? And the answer is, if you're like me, right? I'm the kind of person who I hated final exams, okay? Because I write slow, I think slow, I can really understand something, but you put me in a time-pressured situation, and I just collapse in a heap. Okay, so my exam marks are really bad for the HSC, okay? But if you say, okay, you know, Mr. Webb, write a speech, okay? And you give me like a couple of weeks to do it, I will write a killer speech and I will get 19 out of 20 for it, okay? But that kind of thing can't be tested by a final exam, right? You know, in the same way, for a subject like drama or visual arts, okay? They've got their final exam, but it's very obvious that someone who's good at drama or visual arts may not necessarily be good at a final written exam because the skill sets are totally different. Does that make sense? Okay. So this mark is useful, number one, because it should tell me who's best and who's worst, right? But more importantly, it shows me that ranking on the basis of a wide range of things. I can test lots of different skills and lots of different kinds of knowledge, which a final HSC exam cannot do. Okay. So here's what happens. The Board of Studies looks at this, okay, they look at the marks that I submit as a teacher about you, they take the rankings, and they also take these differences, okay? So looking at this, what's that, 13 and 15, okay? Now looking at that, firstly you can tell, right, who's meant to be better and who's meant to be worse. But secondly, you can also tell, like, the gap from first to second is wildly different from the gap to second to third. Right? These two people are really close together and these people are not, right? So the Board of Studies wants to take that into account and not just say, oh, first and then second and then third. This person who's in second gets really ripped off by that comparison, okay? Because third is like really way down actually, okay? And fourth is even further after that, okay? So what is the actual process by which they take that and put it together with an exam mark? So this is what's called the school assessment. Okay. that raw mark gets looked at, they take the ranks, they take the differences, and then they ignore it. Okay? So then, what they're going to do is they're going to replace that school assessment with another mark. And the question is, where does that come from? Okay? The other mark is going to be called, because the process is moderation, they call this mark the school moderated assessment. Okay? Who's heard of that phrase before? Anyone? Okay, all right. I'll keep going. So the question is, how do they determine what these marks are going to be? So you go and do your final exam. Okay, so we'll call this the Board of Studies exam. Right? Now this is out of 100. Okay, so you get some kind of score. Right? Now suppose this is what we get. Now this is interesting. Okay, because here, this order of marks is going to become surprisingly unimportant. It's really important for you guys who are in Math 7 to work really hard. Here's why. Suppose the person who's first still comes first, okay? So they get 95, okay? And the person who came second, they do, well, let's see. Yeah, they do pretty close, okay? These two down here, this is interesting, right? Suppose they don't do as well as first and second, but, you know, before we had like marks in the 70s and the 60s or something, didn't I? Is that what I put, right? It looks like they went really, really poorly, okay? But what they actually get in the final exam, suppose it's quite high, right? Number one, suppose it's quite high. Number two, suppose this guy who came fourth, right, actually comes third in this final exam, okay? So it's like, if all I had was a final exam, right, then I would look at this and say, this guy's the worst guy, okay? This is me. I crashed and burned on the exam, relatively speaking, okay? Even though I'm actually not that bad if you take into account all the skills that this subject represents, okay? So here's what's actually really interesting, and this is what I didn't understand, okay? What they do with these marks, sorry, it's a 91, is they take the total, okay? Now what is the total? Okay, that's 10, 18, plus, these are all going to become 9, so it's like 368, I think, so I don't know, something like that, okay? 368. Suppose that was the total, I don't know, someone can check for me. Once they've got the total, okay, they now take that total and they just put it in a big heap for the whole school. Okay, was that right? Yeah. Right, okay. So now, this 368, right, this is where they're going to get all of your new marks from. Okay, this school moderated assessment, okay? Because what this tells you is, that's kind of how good you guys really are with regard to the rest of the state. Your marks here might look pretty poor, but actually you guys are great, right? When we compare you with the rest of the state, this is the exam that everyone does, okay? So they're going to take this 368 and they're going to distribute those 368 marks across these 4 people in a way that, number one, preserves their ranks, and number two, preserves the distances between them, okay? So I'm not sure actually how this is going to work, so there's a formula that goes into this, okay? But whatever this, you know, A, B, C, D. A, B, C, D will all add up to 368, okay? Now you saw the numbers before, they weren't going to add up to 368 because you had some really low marks here, okay? But by virtue of the fact that the final exam shows us, you guys are much smarter than the school assessment would have revealed, okay? That's why everything gets sort of pulled up, as it were, right? So this moderating process tells us, you guys are a smart school, we'll drag those up, and it could do vice versa. If you're a poor school and your assessment marks look great and your final exam, you all sucked. Okay, does that make sense? So, this is the process of moderation, right? And what it means is, as well, if all of your marks together, right, are what gets put in a heap and then you get your school mark, okay? This is why it's so critically important that you all work together. It's not like each individual and how you perform, okay? And this is also one of the reasons why people who are in selective schools get such a big advantage over the rest of the state. Because obviously all of your scores as a whole, as a cohort, you're all going to lift each other, okay? So that's why study groups are so important. Because it's not just about you and how good you know your subject, but how well everyone does together, okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. All right, now, what will happen is whatever these numbers are put together with this mark, okay? And then they go 50-50, and you get what's called your final HSC mark for that subject, okay? So there will be 4 marks here, which are averaged according to what this moderated assessment is and what your exam mark is, okay? Right, that's moderation.